Gentlemen, good evening.
Good evening.
I suppose we'll start with you, Mr. Ngobeni, to get into the merits of this case, to understand how it got to this point, how Malema is affiliated with On Point. Is it 43 million that was given to this company to do some construction in Limpopo, which I understand was actually a job that was completely done. Why are we here at this point?
No, on the contrary, actually, if just for a little bit of background.
Yes.
If you recall, the former public protector, Tuliba Donsela, investigated allegations of tender fraud and corruption in Limpopo by a company called On Point, which was in part owned by Malema and his friends. She issued scathing report with very specific recommendations around 2012. Among those recommendations were that she found that there was evidence of a crime, that indeed there had been fraud in the procurement of those contracts for On Point, and that there had been tender irregularities. She went so far as to recommend that the State Attorney's Office be instructed to bring a lawsuit to recover the money. Some people are saying 52 million, some are saying 43. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was a lot of money. She recommended that that should be done. That was never done. Then the NPA initiated some prosecution in respect of Mr. Malema. The case went on until 2015, when a judge struck the case off the roll, because again, the NPA, in a very unconvincing way, claimed that they could not proceed with the case because at that point one of the accused was ill. But it's been almost 3 years since the case was struck off the roll under the Criminal Procedures Act.
So it wasn't a lack of evidence, so to speak?
That's not a lack of evidence. In fact, based on what we now know as the jurisprudence of this country, what the public protector found against Mr. Malema was substantial evidence in and of itself, and it's binding because Mr. Malema never appealed those findings of the public protector.
Right. So I suppose, shall we say, Afriforum, Professor Siposiepe, is well in their place to be able to pursue this case as a civil organization that does private prosecutions. The NPA has failed to take it to court, and yet there's tangible evidence coming from the public protector that is supposed to be binding.
Well, I think the first thing that we must talk about is whether there is a case for the NPA to pursue. And given what the public protector has said, and given what the EFF and other parties had actually encouraged and forced the Constitutional Court to say that the findings and the remedial actions are binding, there is little room for the NPA to maneuver. What the Afriforum is saying is that if the NPA is not going to bring those charges, they are going to try to move towards a private prosecution. So the question that we should have answered or asked as a society and as a country is whether private prosecution is desirable and whether it is also constitutional. But we're too obsessed with Jacob Zuma to answer the question. What Afriforum is actually doing is simply saying, when we establish ourselves and establish this unit and invited Gerinel, we are going to try to pursue private prosecution. And they are simply delivering on their promise and threat. Then the issue that would be of interest also is, and which raises concerns, and people have already said that, is that when you have a private prosecution, the agenda that drives it may have less to do with justice. It may be, and in this case, it will appear that we are opening ourselves to prosecution against certain people which may be political and which will also be racial. And we want to see organizations, because some of us do not see Afriforum as a civil rights organization, which our media is saying it is. Right. We see it as an organization that is there for the interests of mainly white and largely Afrikaner. And we don't hold that against them. Black people must stop complaining when others are concerned about their own, because the Constitution, when it was written, it says there will be respect for cultural and linguistic rights and all that. So they are simply using that to pursue their own interests. We spend time complaining rather than pursue our own interests.
Yeah.
But the issue is private prosecution is an issue that we should have spoken about, and also they have rules and regulations if ever it is allowable. But their lawyer, Paul is here, he might actually give us guidance on whether it is something that should be tested constitutionally, or whether it can stand the master of constitutional.
Yeah, let's get Oliver to give us his take. Professor taking us back to whether this is even constitutional to start with, to have private prosecution, given the history of this country. I think is also kind of thrown in the race card there to say, you know, whose interests are they serving at the end of the day? What is your thought on that?
Importantly, I think we need to ask ourselves the question, does the NPA always do what is correct? And you don't need to do much investigation to come to realize that the answer is not yes in that instance, right? The NPA will pursue cases it thinks are in public interest, right? But the NPA often misses the mark on what is in public interest, and therefore we as the public should be at liberty to be able to say, no, this is in fact in public interest, and we will dedicate the resources and time towards pursuing this case. And this is what Afriforum is doing, right? But whether Afriforum is the right sort of group to do this, I'm not convinced. In fact, Afriforum, correctly, as Professor Siepe says, is not a civil rights movement, because no one in this country is denied civil rights. So there's no space for a civil rights movement. There may be a space for a socio-economic rights movement, which is a different conversation. In fact, Afriforum behaves quite like a domestic terrorist group, if we are being honest about the sort of behavior that they're putting out there. But importantly, whether Afriforum is doing it for political or racial motives, the primary question here is there cause for action?
Well,
right?
Kali Kriel is on the phone line now. Good evening to you. Thank you for joining us. I want to believe you were hearing what some of our analysts here were saying with regards to the case. Your move to say you want to prosecute Julius Malema privately. I'm sure you've been answering the question of selective prosecution from, we seem to have lost him. Please try to get a hold of him as well, so we can have some kind of context in this conversation. Oliver, you may go ahead.
So importantly, we need to ask a primary question, is there cause for action here? And the Public Protector's report is very clear that there's cause for action. Prosecution must happen. Now, the NPA chose for some reason, you know, Paul explained here why that's the case, to not pursue the case, right? And so, therefore, anyone is at liberty to be able to say, no,
I think the question that most people are raising is the issue of selective prosecution from organizations like Afriforum. Yes, I suppose that's where their merit is kind of questioned, to say we've seen issues. You say this is about to do with the taxpayers' money that Julius Malema is supposed to have spent. We saw what happened to PIC money through Steinhoff. We didn't see them taking a stand with that. Those are the questions that then come into play. But I want Mr. N.B We perhaps to explain to us what Professor was talking about, to say the rules that need to come with private prosecution. Should it be tested constitutionally going forward?
Well, let's start with this. I mean, make no mistake about it. Afriforum has been found by a court of law to be a racist organization, to be a misogynist organization, to be an organization that even promotes the so-called rape culture on college campuses. It's not a paragon of virtue. But that's besides the point.
Yeah.
The question is whether Malema has a case to answer.
Yeah.
And based on jurisprudence that Malema himself developed, he took Jacob Zuma all the way to the Constitutional Court and asked the Constitutional Court to say public protectors' remedial action and findings are binding unless you have sought a review. There were findings against him which were much more damning, which were pointing to theft, fraud, and corruption. He never appealed those. So at the moment, it will be irrational for the NPA to surrender its right to prosecute Mr. Malema on a case where the evidence is so clear. It's grandstanding by Afriforum.
Definitely.
Well, let's get Kali Kriel. I believe he's on the phone line with us. Kali, good evening to you. Thank you for joining us. Do you have a solid case against Julius Malema? We've seen you trying to go after Grace Mugabe, also Marcus Hustad. That didn't quite pan out well. Are you grandstanding, as we're hearing here in studio? And also, of course, you still need to get a certificate from the NPA to go ahead.
No, we're definitely not grandstanding at the moment. The fact is, it's also not true to say that the case against Grace Mugabe came to nothing. We are going to be in the court on the 10th and 11th of May in the North Gauteng High Court. in our application to set aside diplomatic immunity. So that case is far from over. The fact is, we're seeing an effort now from people to try and sidetrack what the facts are. The facts are that what we have is that Mr. Julius Malema his family trust has a 50% stake in On Point Engineering. On Point Engineering got a contract to assist the Limpopo Department of Roads to award tenders. They then got kickbacks from people that were successful with tenders, millions of rands of kickbacks. That money was used by Mr. Malema to buy a farm. Later on, after our complaint in 2011 against Mr. Malema, the NPA decided to prosecute Mr. Malema. The asset forfeiture unit took that farm, and Mr. Malema did not appeal that. And the only reason can be is that he knows he did not acquire the funds legally to buy that farm. So the facts are quite clear. Mr. Malema portrays himself as somebody that represents the poor in this country, but then he looted state coffers, he looted resources that should be used for the upliftment of poor people, and those facts cannot change. We cannot stop people to falsely accuse us of being a racist organization. There's no base to those accusations. But these accusations are now being used to try and say that there's not a case against Mr. Malema, and of course there is a case. That's why the NPA started with prosecutions against him. Unfortunately, they have now let it lie for more than 2 years and 8 months, and we have an obligation to make sure that that process goes ahead.
Kali, how do you respond to people that question the timing of Afriforum in announcing this intention to privately prosecute Julius Malema, also the interests that you're serving? We saw what happened with the hundreds of people that died from the listeriosis outbreak that was associated with Tiger brand. We didn't see you making a stance there. You speak of being there for the poor of the poorest. That was a marginalized community that perhaps would have needed your attention as an organization.
Well, what we've done is, if you look at the Life Esidimeni case, our sister organization took on that case on behalf of people that were destitute and poor people. Of course, if you look at something like listeriosis, it has now been taken on by a legal firm that is taking on the people that were involved there. We focus on cases that are not being taken on by organizations or by the National Prosecuting Authority, and the case against Mr. Malema is such a case.
You also said in your press briefing earlier that you're also targeting individuals that seem to be protected politically, that, seem to be untouchable, and that's why you have gone for Julius Malema. Are you seeking as an organization perhaps to influence the political landscape in South Africa by going for such figures?
No, we are seeking to have a situation that there is equality before the law and that the NPA should prosecute without fear, favor, or prejudice. And when they don't do that, we intervene. We're not a political party. We don't participate in elections. But what we need to do as a civil society organization is to uphold the rule of law. And the rule of law requires that everybody is equal before the law. Even if your surname is Malema or if it's Kriel, that should not play a role. And if you have done something that transgresses the law, you should be prosecuted. And
right, Kali, I have a panel with me in studio who perhaps may want to engage you, Professor.
No, I think, number one, I think we all agree with him that there was a report by a public protector, and the report was scathing. And the report pointed out two elements of either fraud, corruption, and somewhere money laundering. I don't think that is a debate. And we also know that the NPA did institute charges against Malema, and the case suddenly disappeared. So anybody can actually raise the issue to say, there needs to be consistency, that the justice must also be seen to be done. But in between, we've also had a very interesting finding or a determination by a Constitutional Court that says the findings and remediations of the private protector are binding. So effectively, the NPA has no room to maneuver. It has to, if it is about law enforcement, it has to follow and make sure that the case continues. So the Afriforum comes in there as saying it's a pressure group that is putting pressure on NPA. Right. And what they've done is that if you don't do this, we're going towards a private prosecution. So in terms of whether the case is there or not, that way I think is not an argument. The issue for me is, again, there's nothing wrong in pressure groups testing our constitution. The issue that one raises is whether that when we're still obsessed with President Jacob Zuma, Afriforum said we're going to hire somebody and we're going to create a unit that will deal with prosecution. They made it was a press conference. But because we're too obsessed with other issues, we didn't allow ourselves to have a discussion around whether private prosecution is desirable. And our concern is where it might actually end up being selective. And of course, there are many, and it's actually nonsense that prosecution are not selective. Even the NPA will be selective. Yeah. So the Khalil must not say they're not selective. But what they need to respond to is when the selectiveness of it begins to not be in the public interest, and also when it is seen as racial. And when there are other cases that merit, and they will become obsessed with an individual because that individual is inconvenient in terms of our politics.
Okay, Mr. Ngobeni, very quickly, I'll come to you, Oliver.
Yes, let's forget about Afriforum. The law is very clear. If you are unhappy with the NPA's decision not to prosecute a person, you can demand that they reconsider that. If they refuse, you take them to court, and you will have a judge instruct them to prosecute. So this notion that they are just this disinterested private group is a lot of nonsense. In fact, the courts have called Afriforum racist, and that's relevant to whether or not they will even have a standing to prosecute Malema. Because if your prosecutor is not unbiased and has already been found to be a bigot by the courts, right, that raises a constitutional question of equal protection. Can any black person's fate be entrusted to the hands of these racists who have been declared to be as such by the courts?
Okay, very strong remarks there coming from Mr. Ngobeni. Kale, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to that.
Yes, we've never been taken to any court with regard to racism, so a court cannot find us guilty on anything that we have not been able to state our case. But what is selective is the fact that people don't mention when we've taken on the Zuma case, it was on behalf of the N.B We family, which is a black family. When we've taken on the N.B case, it was on behalf of Gabriella Engels, who's a black person. When we take on the KwaZulu-Natal Education Department for not building a school in Nkandla, it's on behalf of black people. So we have a track record that we've had many cases representing black people to further their interests. Our record is clear, and it's simply propaganda that is being used to try and silence us, and we won't be silenced. Remember, we cannot be selective in prosecutions. The people that decide on prosecutions is the NPA. We can only take on those cases that they do not prosecute. And unfortunately, it seems that the NPA is selective with regard to who they prosecute and who not. And we have to make sure that there is equality before the law and take on issues. As I've heard from the panel, people say, well, there is a case against Julius Malema. So there's a plot now by the EFF to try and sidetrack the issue. We won't be sidetracked. We believe that Mr. Malema has a case to answer for.
Right. Coming back into studio, Oliver.
Look, I think it's very easy to be angry at the racism that Afriforum represents, and it's understandably so, right? But the facts remain the facts. We first have to ask ourselves, was a crime committed here? Perhaps. So the court needs to test those facts, and the court needs to do that. The court, however, and luckily in South Africa for our jurisprudence, does not test racial biases when it assesses the facts in a situation like this. So if Afriforum is racist, they'll always be racist, but at least the court will be able to say, we don't care about the racism first, we care about, importantly, the facts of the case before us. And I think that's where our focus needs to be. As a secondary issue, then we can ask ourselves, is this in the interest of public good? And as a tertiary issue, we can ask ourselves, perhaps, is private prosecution desirable for our democracy? And I think Professor Siepe has really set out the context for that conversation. Yeah. I think importantly, we need to ask ourselves, and it's true, the MPA is selective, so private prosecution organizations will also be selective depending on what pressure group initiative or what pressure group interest they serve. And that's fine, but we need to ask ourselves whether or not this will strengthen our democracy or weaken our democracy. I'm yet to be convinced it will weaken our democracy. And
I suppose that's the question that people are asking, you know, is it race politics, having private prosecution? Does it continue to perpetuate a community that is, you know, divided in terms of race?
Well, I think what we can learn from this is what goes around comes around. The point, the EFF went to court, constitutional court, and what is happening is the medicine that they preferred for somebody else, and that is going to haunt them. Then second issue is really that justice must be seen to be done. And also it must be consistent, it must be fair. And our fear with private prosecution is that it would be selective by definition. And the instances that Kriel mentions, we can mention many others that they didn't take that would merit far greater attention than these ones. And even these ones that they were pursuing, there was always a political agenda. So let us not mislead ourselves on that. But it's a conversation that we should have. But I also say there is nothing wrong in pressure groups testing our constitution. Right. It needs to be tested all the time, and they are also doing that.
Well, some would say African leaders that are found to be corrupt inherently, you know, throw the race card when they're being held to account. Do you think this is the case in this point? We saw Julius Malema's response on Twitter.
Julius Malema is not incorrect. Afriforum is racist, and they're pursuing him for racist reasons. But that doesn't make the facts of his case disappear. Yeah. So I think we need to be very clear about that. We agree, yes, Afriforum is racist, but the facts of his case remain. And importantly here, it's so Afriforum is racist, yes, but how are we as society organizing and galvanizing ourselves to mobilize against that racism? That's to say that black interest groups should be able to also form an organization and seek certification to privately prosecute. Nothing stops us from doing that. Yeah. Pointing the finger and crying just that another organization is doing it is really not helping the conversation.
Right, so the issue is the existence of Afriforum in a democratic dispensation. Is it healthy for our society or not? And if it's not, what is there to counter that?
We have the tools and resources, I think, to counter that. We're just not galvanizing. We're just not willing to. In fact, I think when it comes to race politics, black people as a collective, we're much quicker to point fingers at each other than to really say, look, the common enemy is not us. The common enemy is them. Let's galvanize our resources and let's mobilize against that. And I think that's the conversation we ought to have.
Gentlemen, thank you for your insight and your input. I certainly appreciate it. Professor Siepe, Oliver Dixon, Carly Kriel on the phone line.
Ngizolilwela Izwela Ngizolilwela Izwela Ngizolilwela bo Yo Izwela Izwela me Izwela me Izwela me